Good morning, everyone. It is time to get started here. I know I'm disturbing everybody there, but anyway, do appreciate everybody being here this morning. We're going to start here with Matthew chapter 17, verses 5 through 8. And I think there's a couple of questions from the workbook. Maybe we'll get to those. Before we get started this morning, if you will, please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you this morning. We praise you and thank you for being our wonderful God, for being the one true God, the only God there is, for being our creator and the sustainer of everything we see and the sustainer of our lives here. We thank you and praise you for all the blessings you give us every day, Father. We love you, and we just come to you humbly to learn from you, and we want to look at your word and study your word, Father, and we ask that you would help us to understand that. Fill us with your wisdom and love so that we can understand these things that are in your word, so that we can grow into a closer image of Jesus Christ and walk this world in our life like he did, Father. We praise you again. Thank you for all your blessings, and we ask that you would be here with us in this study. In Jesus' name, amen. So, you might remember not last week, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, we had just looked at these verses, chapter 17, verses 1 through 4, and you remember this is the Transfiguration we're in the middle of, and here in verse 4, Peter answered and said to Jesus, "Lord, it is good for us to be here. If you wish, let us make here 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah." Then that leads us in to these verses, I'm thinking of it as the second half of the Transfiguration. While he was still speaking, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and suddenly a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Hear him." And when the disciples heard it, they fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. But Jesus came and touched them and said, "Arise and do not be afraid." When they had lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So I want us to look at something with verse 5 here. If you'll bear with me for a minute, I just think this is important. When you look at the King James Version and the Legacy Standard Version, you'll notice that here in this sentence it's, while he spoke, behold, this cloud came in, and behold, a voice out of the cloud. So you have behold twice, and looking back at the interlinear, that is actually the correct translation. There were 2 times where they use behold. They're trying to draw our attention to this cloud and this voice. I think it's very important that we have that. I was kind of disappointed the New King James Version changes the second one to suddenly, and then some of the translations remove one or both of these beholds. So it's like, I don't know why, but I'm just letting you know that. It's important that we have those beholds because they're drawing our attention to these 2 things. It's very important that we notice this. So, let's see. The reason it's important is because they're getting us to focus on these 2. It's really one event, but it's 2 parts of this event. This cloud rolls in, and then you have the voice, right? So I just wanted to point this out because we're kind of going to focus on both of those things a little bit, and I just think it's very important that we see that. Yes, Matt?
We might, in a more modern way, say, look!
Yeah.
Same idea, right? Look at this happen.
Pay attention. Look at this. Here, look. This is important, and that's the idea. That's why I brought this up. Both of these things are very important, and there's good reason to draw our attention to them. So, when we look here in verse 5, while who was speaking? So who was speaking that we're talking about here? It was Peter, right? Yeah, because that's why I was showing us that at the front, so we'd remember at the front that Peter was speaking. He was saying that about the tabernacles. So, now, so Peter was the one that was speaking, and it was while he was still speaking Now, what does this cloud coming in, what does this remind you of? Remind you of?
Well, there's a couple.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Eddie.
I was going to say, the one thing is that while my father, they were the Jews, as they were traveling, and
Yep.
the other one just escaped me from.
Okay, but the pillar of cloud in the wilderness, right?
Another one too, but I can't.
Yeah, and then, okay, well, Matt?
And then even before the wilderness, the Red Sea, when they're crossing, it was there as well.
Yeah.
And then the giving of the Ten Commandments.
Right, Mount Sinai, right?
Yeah.
Yep. That. And another one just popped in my head. I thought of those because I thought those were the first things that came in my head. But then there's also, remember the glory of the Lord in the temple.
That's the one.
There's that one too, and I didn't think of that one. I didn't have it written down, yes.
And that, I think you're referring to when Solomon built the temple.
Yes.
But that happened also in Revelation. There was some imagery like that. And I think there was something real similar in the tabernacle too. The first sacrifices and.
Oh yeah, and they used to see, well, now that you mention that, even at the tent of meeting, before they had the tabernacle, they would see the smoke, the pillar of cloud. I don't know how to say it, but anyway. And because it said they would stand at the doorway of their tents and they would worship God when they saw that happening at the tent of meeting. So yeah, there's all these examples, and I didn't think of all those, but yeah, now that we've gone there, there's a lot of those. So if we look at question 4 from the workbook, now what did the voice from the cloud say about Jesus?
Behold, this is my son,
This is my beloved son, right?
in whom I am well pleased.
Yeah, in whom I am.
Yeah,
Yeah, and hear him, and that's an important part of that, right?
yeah.
So, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased, hear him. Now, who was speaking?
God.
God, right? God the Father. And where have we heard that first part of that before? I think Pat mentioned this the other week. Yes?
When Jesus was baptized.
When Jesus was baptized. Now, he didn't say hear him, but he said the rest of that when Jesus was baptized. So, all right, so we heard that. Now, what might this indicate? What is God telling us here? Yes, Matt?
Well, if you go back to what you just said, while he was still speaking, right? So Peter's saying this kind of dumb stuff right now.
Yeah.
Let's make all these tabernacles for all these
Yep.
other people. No, don't make a tabernacle for Moses and stuff. This is my son, this Jesus, he's the important.
That's the thing that God is stressing. This is my son, hear him, right? And the idea is to focus on Jesus even over the law and the prophets, and that he's the important one now. And is it in Hebrews where he says now he speaks to us through his son,
Yeah.
right? Because we just went over that recently. So the focus is really put on Jesus here by God. God is saying, focus on Jesus, the Lord. He is his son. So, and Jesus is still, he's still in God's will. He's on this plan, God's plan for redemption for all of us. So, now, when God says, hear him, if we think about that, God is telling them in the immediate, okay, just in the immediate context, listen and understand Jesus. Hear and obey him, right? But it's said in a way that is, it's an ongoing fashion. It's not just for like right this moment. It's for ongoing fashion, for an eternity, just always hear and listen to him. And we must listen to Jesus above and beyond everyone else. He must be the one that we're listening to. So let's look at Mark's account here. Mark chapter 9, verses 7 and 8. And a cloud came and overshadowed them, and a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Suddenly, when they had looked around, they saw no one anymore, but only Jesus with themselves. So Mark has a very much summarized account here. Let's look at Luke. Luke chapter 9, verses 34 through 36. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were fearful as they entered the cloud. And a voice came out of the cloud saying, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." When the voice had ceased, Jesus was found alone, but they kept quiet and told no one in those days any of the things they had seen. So what's a little different in verse 34 here that wasn't mentioned in Matthew or Mark?
They were fearful.
They were fearful, right? They were afraid. It scared them. It scared them. We have to remember they just saw the Lord's glory, and they just saw Moses and Elijah there with the Lord. So this is like a supernatural event happening. I think any of us would be scared in this circumstance. Now, and they were already afraid from seeing the Lord's glory and Elijah and Moses. So this just adds to it. This makes them a little more fearful. So it's adding to that. So if we go back to our verses in Matthew, so how do the apostles react to the voice of God? They fall on their faces, right? They fall on their faces. Let's see. They fell on their faces and were greatly afraid. So we still get that fear. And to some degree, though, this is a reverential fear also, because they knew, here's the superior being. They knew to bow down to him, right? They knew to do that. And honestly, if this was going on, would we not be terrified out of our wits, possibly? We might be, because it's a scary supernatural event in some ways. So now how does Jesus react to their fear?
He touched them and said, "Don't be afraid."
He touches them and tells them not to be afraid. Exactly. And if you think about that, this is a kind, a reassuring touch. Hey, it's okay, don't be afraid. Letting them know that he's there with them, that they are safe. So it's a very, very kind thing, because I'm sure it says they were greatly afraid. They were very afraid. And then what did they see when they looked up?
Just Jesus.
Just Jesus. And really, that's all we really need. If you think about it, when we're greatly afraid, when we're really scared or in bad troubles, that's really all we need. We just need the Lord. So, especially facing events we don't understand, which we know to some degree they did not fully understand this. And so Jesus, he's the Son, but also if you think of him, he's like the sun that kind of sends the darkness and the fear away when the sun comes up in the morning. So that's why he's the morning star, right? So if we only understand one thing from the Transfiguration, it should be that we should be listening to Jesus above all others. I think if you don't get anything else out of this, that would be like the main thing. So let's see. Jesus has fulfilled the law and the prophets. He's greater than the law and the prophets. And everybody else, everything else kind of has to take a back seat to him. That's all a part of this new covenant with the Lord. So, does anybody have anything else on these verses? Okay. So looking at Matthew chapter 17, verses 9 through 13. Now as they came down from the mountain, Jesus commanded them, saying, "Tell the vision to no one until the Son of Man is risen from the dead." And his disciples asked him, saying, "Why then do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Pardon me. Jesus answered and said to them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things. But I say to you that Elijah has come already, and they did not know him, but did to him whatever they wished. Likewise, the Son of Man is also about to suffer at their hands." Then the disciples understood that he spoke to them of John the Baptist. Now let's look at Mark's account. Mark chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Now as they came down from the mountain, he commanded them that they should tell no one the things they had seen till the Son of Man had risen from the dead. So they kept this word to themselves, questioning what the rising from the dead meant. And they asked him, saying, "Why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first?" Then he answered and told them, "Indeed, Elijah is coming first and restores all things. And how is it written concerning the Son of Man that he must suffer many things and be treated with contempt? But I say to you that Elijah has also come, and they did to him whatever they wished, as it is written of him." So, what did the disciples not understand in verses 9 and 10? That Jesus was going to rise from the dead, right? They weren't getting that. He was telling them this, and we're going to see him tell them this multiple times on the way to Jerusalem. He's trying to prepare them, but they're not understanding it. It goes against what all of Israel was really expecting of their Messiah. Yes, Pat?
If you go over to Matthew chapter 11,
Uh-huh.
and verse 11 through 14, read that. It talks about John the Baptist and Elijah.
Oh, yeah. Now that was previously, and yeah, we went over that. Let's go back there for a minute. Okay. So Matthew 11.
Verse 11.
And if we start here, we'll start here in verse 11. This is a good place. Okay. So now this was Jesus talking to the other disciples. The apostles had been sent out on their mission. If I remember right, it was chapter 10. They had gone out, or at the end of chapter 10, they had gone out on their mission. They weren't around for this conversation. So like Peter, James, and John, they were out on that, I called it a training mission, which is essentially what it was. And so they weren't here at this time. Now, Jesus had many disciples, so he still had disciples with him at this time, but not those guys. Those guys had been sent out. So they weren't a witness to this conversation. But here Jesus says, "Assuredly, I say to you, among those born of women, there has not risen one greater than John the Baptist, but he who is least in the kingdom of heaven is greater than he. And from the days of John the Baptist until now, the kingdom of heaven suffers violence, and the violent take it by force. For all the prophets and the law prophesied until John. And if you are willing to receive it, he is Elijah who is to come. He who has ears to hear, let him hear." So Jesus is again saying that John the Baptist was the Elijah that was to come. So, let's see. Okay, so here though, they're questioning, and you might wonder, why they're questioning this. Why are they asking this question of Jesus? They're saying, why do the scribes say that Elijah must come first? Well, who did they just see talking to Jesus? Elijah. So we have to look at it this way. If we look at the events that went on right here, Peter just declared Jesus is the Messiah. He tells them that he's going to suffer and he's going to die. And now they see Elijah and they're like, wait, wasn't Elijah supposed to come first? I don't understand. So it's confusing for them. And I think if I put myself in their shoes, I would be lost. I wouldn't know what was going on either. So I think that's a fair kind of summary. And all this has happened in the past, I forget, day or two. It's been pretty quick. So it's just confusing for them. So I don't want to be too hard on the disciples. But at the same time, Jesus is going to keep repeating this and teaching them. And we're going to see that they still struggle to understand this until after he rises again, until he's risen. So let's go back to Matthew here. If we look at chapter 5 in the question 5 in the workbook, when were the disciples to tell others what they had seen?
After Jesus resurrected.
After he rises again, right? Not until Jesus had risen from the dead. Now, why did Jesus tell them this? Well, he's following God's plan, right? So he's following God's plan. It wasn't time, according to God's plan, for people to know this. Remember, everyone is really expecting the Messiah to come and take the throne and be a warrior king style of Messiah. So, now, if we remember what we saw in Mark that they did not understand, if we look at question 6 in the workbook, who did Jesus say had come?
John the Baptist.
John the Baptist. He was the Elijah to come, right? So he had fulfilled that prophecy, and this was prophesied in Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. I'm pretty sure we've looked at this before, but it has that word, behold, behold, pay attention, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord. And he will turn the hearts of the fathers to the children, and the hearts of the children to their fathers, lest I come and strike the earth with a curse. So what's being restored here? Their hearts, right? We're seeing that their hearts are being restored. Now, somehow this had got, I'll say twisted, or had come to mean, and what the religious leaders were teaching was that he would come and restore all things for the Lord. He would come and restore everything and make it like a perfect place for the Lord to come in and rule. So the disciples had heard this and knew this. Israel was looking for that different type of Messiah, and they were looking for this different type of Elijah than what they really got. So they knew this was a sign, though. They just didn't fully understand everything, and that's because some of the teachings they were given were wrong. So they expected Elijah to come in power and fire and be cleansing the nation, and maybe even the world, but especially the nation of Israel. So they misunderstood both John and Jesus and the ministries they would have. So if we come back to our verses, in verse 11, when Jesus is saying, indeed Elijah is coming first and will restore all things, I've seen where people have taken that out of context and said that they're expecting Elijah to come again before Jesus returns. Yes, Matt?
It's interesting, of course, in verse 13 we see it's John the Baptist, but John the Baptist himself in John chapter 1 was asked, are you the Christ, or are you Elijah, or are you the prophet? And the prophet being the reference to Moses saying, there will a prophet come after me.
Right,
But he denied all that, including the Elijah part. So, but I mean, of course, John wasn't literally Elijah, but Jesus made the application that he's fulfilling Malachi, like he said.
Right, he's fulfilling the role.
It's interesting that John kind of denies it there, but Jesus affirms it here.
Right. Well, John denies that he's actually literally Elijah.
Yeah.
And I think we can understand that. And I don't think that verse was intending to say that literally Elijah was going to come back and do that. Remember, Elijah never died, right? So, I mean, he's really, what would he come back? He would leave heaven? Probably not willingly,
He came back for the Transfiguration.
But he did come back for the Transfiguration. So that was part of God's plan. He did that. So, okay.
Well, I think John just was in the spirit of Elijah.
Yes, that's the idea. Yeah.
At least that's the way I think of him. He was
Yes.
Elijah in a lot of ways.
Yeah, he was like Elijah in a lot of ways, and it was in that spirit of Elijah that he came back. So, but if you take that verse 11 out of context, and I'd seen where people had done that, and they try to make it sound like Elijah will come again before Jesus returns. But here, Jesus is not saying that. He's repeating what they had been taught. Indeed, Elijah is coming first and will restore all things, but I say to you that this has happened already. So this is all really one sentence, and I think some translations, maybe the LSB, has it as one sentence. It's not really two separate statements. And so if you take that out of context, you might think that is another prophetic Elijah returning, but that's not the case. So since I had seen that, I thought I would mention that just so you know. Because if you read the whole thing in context correctly, you see that had already occurred. And so that's what Jesus was telling them. Yes?
There's a Jewish tradition, at least today, I don't know how ancient it is, but when they have their Passover, they leave an empty seat for Elijah to come. And I think there's even a tradition where the youngest child goes to the door and to see if Elijah's coming down the street. So there's this expectation, like you said, that Elijah is coming back. Yeah,
they're still looking for Elijah because they're still looking for the Messiah, right? But yeah, the Jews at their Passover, my understanding too, I've read that before too, they leave a seat for Elijah at their table. And then they are expecting Elijah still because, of course, they're still expecting the Messiah. So they're still looking for both of them. Let's see. So anyway, so that's an example of just taking things out of context and not reading. We need to make sure that we're reading the whole passage and the verses before and after because of what Jesus says after that verse. Let's see. And Jesus is just making sure that they understand that he's saying, yes, you've been taught this, but this has already happened. It has occurred. So, and even like when we think about things like this, we need to remember that even the chapters and the verses, those are more modern additions to help us be able to index and memorize the Bible, remember where things are and that type of thing. I'm not a good memorization person, but for people who are good at that, they can literally just, remember things like crazy. So, but anyway, it's still a good indexing system, which is basically what it is. All right, so anything else on these verses? All right. So let's see. If we look at our map, remember that the Transfiguration just occurred. Jesus is somewhere now in the Galilee area. And we know from reading ahead that he's heading to Capernaum. Let's see. So he's in this northern area. He's heading south because he just came from, now depending on what you believe, he just came from the Caesarea Philippi area. He may have just came from Mount Hermon. Depends on how you look at that and how you read that. When I read this, it made me think otherwise, but that's fine. That is a traditional place. But he is on his way to Jerusalem, and he's telling the disciples what to expect. So they struggle to understand that and believe that the Messiah must suffer and die because that's not what they've really been taught to expect. So let's look at our verses here. Matthew chapter 17, verses 14 through 18. And when they had come to the multitude, a man came to him, kneeling down to him, saying, Lord, have mercy on my son, for he is an epileptic and suffers severely, for he often falls into the fire and often into the water. So I brought him to your disciples, but they could not cure him. Then Jesus answered and said, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him here to me. And Jesus rebuked the demon, and it came out of him, and the child was cured from that very hour. Now, this is a good summary, but we need to look at Mark's account. There's so much detail in Mark's account. So Mark chapter 9, verses 14, and this is going to run through, is it just through 22? It runs down through 27, actually. So Mark chapter 9, we'll read verses 14 through 18 first. And when he came to the disciples, he saw a great multitude around them and scribes disputing with them. Immediately when they saw him, all the people were greatly amazed and running to him, greeted him. And he asked the scribes, What are you discussing with them? Then one of the crowd answered and said, Teacher, I brought you my son who has a mute spirit. And wherever it seizes him, it throws him down. He foams at the mouth, gnashes his teeth, and becomes rigid. So I spoke to your disciples that they should cast it out, but they could not. Now, here in verse 14, this is where I mentioned they came off the mountain, and Luke's account says the next day, that this is the next day, like almost like they spent the night on the mountain and they came down. And there were these scribes and the other disciples here in a dispute. So, now, what kind of a spirit does the boy have here that we're told? It's in verse 17, a mute spirit, right? So it's a mute spirit, but what other problems does that spirit cause? If you look at,
Like he has epilepsy.
right, if you look at verse 18, it sounds a lot like epilepsy, right? And that's why in Matthew, he says, or it's translated as the boy has epilepsy. Now, the literal Greek word means something like moonstruck or lunatic because they believe he was adversely affected by the moon. That's just, that's just those days back then. That's the way people thought. But we see from the account here, he actually has this spirit, right? And then, like I said, we translate it nowadays and think, well, that's an example of like epilepsy. But here we do see that it's a spirit. So, and he causes these other problems about foaming at the mouth, gnashing his teeth. We saw that he falls down in the fire and falls into the water, like the demon is trying to kill him, basically, right? So let's read the next verses. Verses 19 through 22. He answered him and said, O faithless generation, how long shall I be with you? How long shall I bear with you? Bring him to me. Then they brought him, now to Jesus. And when he saw him, now this when the boy saw Jesus, immediately the spirit convulsed him, and he fell on the ground and wallowed, foaming at the mouth. So he asked his father, how long has this been happening to him? And he said, from childhood. And often he has thrown him both into the fire and into the water to destroy him. But if you can do anything, have compassion on us and help us. So, how did the spirit react when he saw Jesus in verse 20? Well, he convulsed him, right? He immediately had like a seizure, like what we would call a seizure. He convulsed him. He fell on the ground. So, what does the man say at the last, which shows his doubt or his lack of faith? In that last, in the last verse.
If you can do it.
He says, if you can do anything. If you can do anything. Other times we've seen people who say, if you will. They realize that Jesus has the power, and they're like, well, if you will, I know you can do this for me. Here, this guy is unsure if Jesus can help. So he doesn't just doubt, would Jesus help, but can he help? So it's a different issue. Yes,
Of course,
Matt.
the next verse, Jesus goes on, if you can, like, he picks up on that.
Yes.
I can do it,
Yeah, and that's true. In the very next verse, let's look at those verses. Jesus said to him, if you can believe, all things are possible to him who believes. Immediately the father of the child cried out and said with tears, Lord, I believe, help my unbelief. When Jesus saw that the people came running together, he rebuked the unclean spirit, saying to it, Deaf and dumb spirit, I command you, come out of him and enter him no more. Then the spirit cried out, convulsed him greatly, and came out of him, and he became as one dead, so that many said, he is dead. Pardon me. But Jesus took him by the hand and lifted him up, and he arose. So how does Jesus respond to the man in verse 23?
Well, some translations translate that as a question, or even an exclamation.
Yes.
Throw it back at him.
Yeah.
If you can.
And I think that's a good point, right? I think that's a very good point to make. Because Jesus is saying, not outwardly, but he's basically saying, I have the power, but you need to believe, right? You need to have faith. You need to believe. He does turn it on the man. The man needs to believe. If you can believe, that's a key thing. And you're right. Some translations really point that out a little better. They really.
Like he's quoting the man.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. If you can believe, So then we see this man, he makes this plea, and you'll notice it's immediately, he cries out, he's very sincere, he believes, but he acknowledges, I need help with my unbelief. I do have problems with that. And it's don't we all have some of that problem? I mean, that's something we all need help with. So it gets to you a little bit, I guess is what I'm thinking of. It just gets to you. So now, in verse 25, what two descriptions do we see of this spirit? It's unclean and deaf and dumb. So really three descriptions, I guess, but I kind of broke those into two. But anyway, unclean and deaf and dumb. Now, after the spirit left, how did the boy appear to the crowd?
Dead.
He appeared dead, right? He appeared dead, but who helped the boy up? Jesus. Again, Jesus touches, reaches out and takes. Now, normally, Jewish people back then especially would not have wanted to touch somebody like that. He was considered very unclean. They would have thought he would like corrupt themselves. I've mentioned this before, but Jesus always touches these people. He always takes them kindly and helps them. So just something to think about. So he took him by the hand and helped him up. Now I believe we are out of time for this morning. Does anybody have anything before we're...
Just real quick.
Yes.
I know Matthew says it's epileptic.
Yes.
You know what I just said. It's pretty clear here, this is beyond a medical condition.
Yes.
This was a demon, and this was an opportunity to perform a miracle.
Absolutely. Yeah, Matthew says and it's really not Matthew saying that so much as it's our modern translation. I guess I wasn't as clear as I meant to be. That's just the modern translation that ascribes that to epilepsy. Really, we know from the accounts reading here that that was a demon. And even Matthew says it's a demon when you look at the whole context of what he says. So we know it's a demon and it's not epilepsy, but it's similar to epilepsy. So in the modern translation, that's where they get that, because he's doing that. And I knew a guy back in high school that had epilepsy, and certainly that's kind of what it looked like. So I understand that's how they translate it, but that's not really what it is. Just like you're saying.
Yeah, I'm not knocking what you said, I'm just saying.
Oh, no.
We need to differentiate.
We need to make sure it's clear, yes.
This is beyond a regular medical condition.
Yes, this is. Now, Jesus did heal a lot of medical conditions, but this is beyond that, and Jesus still took care of it. Yes, ma'am?
Some translations will just say seizures to kind of show the symptom without maybe giving a diagnosis.
That might be a better way of doing
Otherwise, it
it.
sounds like a medical diagnosis, like he's saying.
Yeah. So it's not really that medical problem. It's really more of a demonic seizures problem and a possession problem, like we would think of. Not to make you think of those crazy movies, but that is kind of what it is. So, thank y'all for your time and attention this morning.